In this section, I want to talk about diseases that can be transmitted by mosquitoes. And one of the most common worldwide and one of the most dangerous worldwide is malaria. Malaria can be found in lots of different organisms, not just in humans. In fact, I study malaria in birds with a friend of mine who is still at Fresno State. The genus of parasite that causes malaria is called Plasmodium. In humans, there are approximately 5 different species that can cause malaria, and each of them can cause different severity of disease and different intensity of disease. In patients who have malaria, symptoms include fever and chills, and it can lead to death. The highest fatality levels are seen in children right around the age of 5, maybe a little bit older, as their immune system starts to ramp up. And, these are some data from 2021. It's a little bit tricky to find more recent data because you're having all of these organizations that are having to compile data from all the different countries that experience malaria. So the World Health Organization estimates that there were about 247 million cases of malaria in 2021, leading to at least 400,000 deaths. So worldwide, this is a very, very common infection, and it is very dangerous. So this is a propaganda poster from, I believe, World War II, because soldiers who were in Asia, so everywhere from like the Philippines up through Japan, were getting malaria. So they would give them mosquito nets. And literally that's one of the best preventatives. You sleep under a net so the mosquitoes can't bite you. I am in no way, shape, or form expecting you to remember anything really about the life cycle of malaria because it's a very complex life cycle. And that's really what I want you to appreciate, that it's a super complex life cycle. Inside of humans, we'll start right here. Inside of humans, so the mosquito bites and injects one life stage of the parasite. The parasite can go into the liver. It turns into a different life form. It ruptures the cells. It gets into the bloodstream as a different life form. It matures into another life form and eventually becomes gametes that get picked up by the mosquito. And then it does different life stages inside of the mosquito before it goes back into a human. And the complexity of the life cycle is what can make developing a vaccine really difficult. Do you protect against this stage or that stage or this stage or that stage? So vaccine development has really been challenging, but we'll see in a couple of slides that it's actually starting to work, and there are some vaccines that work and that are in clinical trials. So one of the hallmark symptoms of malaria is fever. Fever is really classic. If you have something in your bloodstream, your immune system says, ooh, that doesn't belong, and so you end up with a fever. In 1917, there was an Austrian neurologist, and he had patients who had syphilis. And what he did was he gave those patients with syphilis malaria. And what happened was in the malaria syphilis patients, right, they developed a high fever because of the malaria. The fever killed the bacteria that caused syphilis. So then the patient wouldn't die of syphilis, but then they had malaria. So, that's a pro and con that you have to think about yourself. And he actually won a Nobel Prize for this in 1928. And some people have even proposed using this as a therapy for Lyme disease. We do have therapies now to treat malaria. So if this was done maybe in a very controlled way using a laboratory strain of malaria that you were pretty sure you'd be able to treat, maybe. And part of this is because the bacteria that causes syphilis is pretty closely related to the bacteria that causes Lyme disease. So if you raise the fever and it kills syphilis, maybe it will also kill Lyme disease. One of the really effective therapies against malaria is a drug called artemisinin. It's derived from plants And what's really cool about it is the discoverer is a woman who is a physician or a scientist in China, and she had read about some of the ancient cures that people used to try to fight things like malaria, and that led her to the discovery of this compound, and she won the Nobel Prize for this in 2015. Unfortunately, what we are seeing also, though, is some parasites are now becoming resistant to this therapy, so it's necessary to develop new therapies as well. Vaccine development, like I mentioned earlier, is ongoing. There are some really promising vaccines that have come out within the past year or two. It is made difficult by the complex life cycle of the parasite. These vaccines, I looked at the efficacy rates a little bit ago. They're not as effective, they're not like 100% effective, but at the same time, even a 70% reduction in the number of cases would be life-changing. So it's really great that these vaccines are showing a lot of promise. They are being developed. They are getting more cost-effective. One of the newer vaccines that came out last year is anywhere from $2 to $4 for a dose of the vaccine. And when you're talking about the areas of the world where malaria is most common, $2 to $4 is still a really big deal. But if it costs more than that, it's out of the reach of a lot of the patients who could benefit the most. So these developers that are able to continually improve the vaccine and to make it more cost-effective are really doing a lot to benefit world health. One really interesting thing about malaria, at least, again, for me, I'm a microbiologist, I think all this stuff is kind of cool, is when you think about the coevolution of humans and their parasites, or any animal and their parasites. When you have an organism that is being infected by a parasite, at some point, there are going to be people or organisms, whatever, let's say people. There are going to be people who have a trait that has arisen randomly. That's evolution, it's random. A trait that arose randomly that provided some kind of benefit. And if it provided enough of a benefit that that person was able to be more reproductively successful, those offspring may have that benefit, and their offspring, and their offspring, and their offspring. And so the benefit that we actually see here is, especially in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, shown here and here. So down here in green, we're looking at where is malaria endemic. And so the worst numbers of malaria are mostly found here in sub-Saharan Africa, and then some of these islands off the coast of Southeast Asia. And in red, what we're looking at is the frequency of people who carry the genes for sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia causes red blood cells to be misshapen. And overview of human genetics. For each gene that we have two copies, one that we inherited from the mother and one that we inherited from the father. So with sickle cell anemia, it's a mutation. If your mom and dad gave you a good copy, you have normal circular red blood cells, like you see in any picture of red blood cells. If mom and dad both gave you the sickle cell gene, then you have these weird curved shaped red blood cells, and they don't carry oxygen very well. They tend to cause blood clots, and so that can be a really dangerous disease. It can be fatal for a lot of people. But if you got one bad copy and one good copy, you have these red blood cells that still work to transmit oxygen, which is what a red blood cell does, but you are immune to malaria. So there's one life stage of malaria where they have to get into your red blood cells. And in patients who have one good and one bad copy of the sickle cell gene, the malaria parasite can't get in. So when I told you about evolution and you have a trait that's really good, it'll persist in the population because it's good and it's helpful. But sickle cell anemia does not sound good or helpful. It sounds like you're going to die of sickle cell anemia. That's terrible. Why would that persist? Well, it persists because when people, especially here and here, right? When people are carriers of the gene but don't actually have the disease, they're immune to malaria. And so you see the highest levels of the gene that causes sickle cell and the highest levels of malaria line up perfectly. So it's really interesting, again, at least to me. There are lots of other mosquito-transmitted infections. When we talk about viruses, we tend to call them arboviruses, arthropod-borne viruses. One that used to be really common in the US, but is still common in other parts of the world, is called yellow fever. It's called yellow fever because it affects the liver and patients can develop jaundice, and when you have jaundice, you turn yellow. So it causes fever, headache, and jaundice. There is a vaccine available. It's estimated now, even though we have a vaccine, that there are still a couple 100,000 cases per year, leading to 30,000 deaths. This is worldwide. We have dengue fever. Dengue fever is sometimes called breakbone fever because it causes such significant joint pain that people feel like their bones are breaking. So it causes fever, headache, joint pain. It can cause hemorrhaging. It can be very dangerous. It's really unknown how many people get the infection every year. 50 to 528 million cases per year, with about 25,000 deaths. West Nile virus and other encephalitis viruses are also transmitted by mosquitoes. For the most part, the majority of patients will get what we call flu-like symptoms. So fever, tired, a headache, just you don't feel very good. But some of these viruses can also cause encephalitis. They can go to the brain and cause swelling, and that can cause death in a patient. This infection, West Nile specifically, is considered an emerging infectious disease in the US because we actually never had it in the US until 1999. It got introduced into New York State, and by 2004 it was in California. It reached all the way across the US. Other mosquito-transmitted infections, another one that's considered an emerging infectious disease in the Americas is chikungunya. It translates to that which bends up because it causes, again, significant joint pain and swelling. In most patients, they would experience maybe only a fever and headache, but some can get joint pain and hemorrhaging. And there's also lymphatic like filarial worm infections. So these filarial worms are multicellular, they're eukaryotic worms. They're transmitted by lots of mosquitoes, but what they do is they get inside the lymphatic system. So in your body, you have two kind of fluid transport systems. You have your lymphatic system and you have your blood vessels. And when you have blockage of the blood vessels, you die because that's a blood clot. When you have blockage of the lymphatic vessels, you don't usually die, but you end up with such a backup or buildup of fluid that the tissues just swell. This is edema just caused by fluid buildup because there are parasitic worms blocking the lymphatic system. Sometimes this is also called elephantiasis because the legs will swell up and they can look like an elephant leg. There are lots of other insects besides just mosquitoes that can transmit infections. This is a kissing bug. You might ask why they are called kissing bugs. Because they like to bite around the mouth. The infections are not actually transmitted by the bite, though. The infection that we typically see from kissing bugs is called Chagas disease. It's transmitted by, it's caused by a parasite called Trypanosoma cruzi. And the way kissing bugs works is they will bite you right around the mouth, on the face, right? And they defecate at the same time. The bite tends to be itchy, so you might scratch and you rub the feces into the wound caused by the bite. The parasites are in the feces, so that's how they get into your body. The early stage of disease is often characterized by eyelid swelling, and the chronic phase involves the central nervous system and the heart. And we do see Chagas disease in the Americas, especially Central and South America, but it can be in the US as well. There are some flies that bite. We've talked about house flies before, but there are biting flies. This one is called the tsetse fly. It also transmits a trypanosoma parasite, but it's a different species. It's Trypanosoma brucei. And this parasite causes what we call sleeping sickness. What it does is the parasite gets into the brain, right, central nervous system, and that causes disruption of the sleep cycle. So people are awake when they should be asleep, they're asleep when they should be awake, they don't sleep, they can't be woken up, like all of these issues with the sleep cycle. And when you mess with people's sleep cycle, you actually mess with their brain, like both psychologically and physically. And so you see significant mental deterioration, and it's eventually fatal. Like, you have to sleep. You will die if you don't sleep. And so when your sleep cycles are messed up and you can't sleep, or if you sleep too much and your brain just gets damaged, you can die. There's another type of biting fly called a black fly that transmits a parasite. I'm terrible at Latin, so I hardly ever try to pronounce the names. But it causes river blindness. It's one of the more common causes of blindness in Africa. And so what you have here, it's, I don't know if you can tell, but you have, these are generally younger people who haven't been exposed to the parasite yet, and they are leading older people around because those older people are blind from the parasite. Deer flies, another type of biting fly, can transmit what's called African eyeworm, and I can actually pronounce this one, loa loa. And so you can actually see the worm in the eye. So, fun fact, one of the best ways to get these worms out of the eye, okay, eyes creep me out, so I actually hate looking at this picture, but one of the best ways to get these worms out is you have to paralyze the worm so it doesn't like thrash around when you're trying to remove it. You can paralyze the worm by using a 10% cocaine solution. So you drop it into the eye, the worm will become paralyzed temporarily, and then you can surgically remove the worm. Gross, right? Other biting insects include fleas, which if you have pets, you know about fleas. But fleas can transmit things like plague or typhus, which has fever, muscle pain, disorientation, and seizures. Sand flies can transmit leishmaniasis. This is a sand fly. It doesn't look like a classic fly. We do have leishmaniasis in the Americas. The more common form we have in the Americas is cutaneous. It causes like skin infections. In other parts of the world, they have visceral, meaning the parasite gets deep into the body and can damage the spleen and the liver. We have body lice. We don't have a ton of body lice in the US. Head lice are way more common, but body lice can happen, especially in the unhoused communities. So where people don't have access to wash their clothes frequently, they don't have access to wash their bodies frequently. And body lice can transmit typhus. They can also transmit a bacteria related to the one that causes Lyme disease that causes relapsing fever. And this is not an infection, but it's still really gross. Bot flies are a type of fly where the larvae burrow into skin. And so there are some bot flies that actually infect humans. And so this is a picture of a human infected with a bot fly. These are what the bot flies look like. So they'll do their larval stage inside of the host, and then they'll fall out and mature into the adult fly. How do you prevent infection? Well, be aware of what arthropods or insects might be in the area. If you're in a tick habitat, it tells you right here, stay on the trails. A lot of these type of ticks right here, they like to do what's called questing. They'll crawl up to the tall grass, and as you walk by and brush on the tall grass, they'll just jump onto you. So stay on the trail, wear shoes, right? Cover your feet. Repellents, there are some really great insect and tick repellents. And then check yourself for ticks, put your clothes in the dryer, and that's how you can try to prevent infection. And if you live or are visiting an area that has a lot of mosquitoes, you can also always get a mosquito net.